And good afternoon. My name is Bob Hamilton. I'm the head of Eurasia Research here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I'm joined today by two of our Eurasia fellows and Russia specialists, Olga Khvostunova and András Tóth-Czifra. First of all, thank you for supporting FPRI. Thank you for being here today. A reminder that if you look in the chat, you will see Olga's and András' latest work, and also a link to the Bear Market Brief, of which András is a writer for Bear Market Brief. You'll see a link to the BMB Substack in the chat. So let me briefly introduce our panelists today. Olga Khvostunova is a fellow in the Eurasia program at FPRI. She's a journalist, researcher, and political analyst, and also a PhD student at Stony Brook University. András Tóth-Czifra is a fellow in the Eurasia program at FPRI and a contributing author for FPRI's Bear Market Brief newsletter. He holds a master's degree in political science and economics from Corvinus University of Budapest and is a political risk analyst in the private sector. So, and a reminder, please put your questions. If you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A on Zoom here. Let me jump right in and ask Olga and András. So Putin's re-election on March 17th, the re-election start on the 15th and end the 17th, is a foregone conclusion. And it will mark 24 years of essentially uninterrupted power for him, aside from his brief interlude as prime minister, but still de facto leader from 2008 to 2012. So how has Putin changed over this period, and how has Russia's style of governance changed? Let me ask you, I'll start with you, Olga, and then move to you, András.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I hope I can offer some useful insights. So I've been sort of watching what's going on in Russian politics since I graduated the university. I was a journalist in Russia before I moved to the US. And I think I remember Putin's first election in 2000. It was really different compared to what we have now, because at the time, I believe we had maybe 19 different candidates on the ballot, along with Mr. Putin. And whoever else is on the ballot now is completely irrelevant. As you said, the result is pretty much already known. So over the last 24 years, I think we have seen several stages of Putin changing. I think in the first term, he mostly presented himself as a reformer. He was able to actually implement a bunch of pretty significant reforms, administrative reform, tax reform, which allowed Russia to grow, and for which he kind of earned the reputation of a person who brought stability and prosperity to Russia, for which he's still being remembered. I think in the second term, he was reaping the benefits of of the results of these reforms. And then he stepped aside. He let his successor, Dmitry Medvedev, to rule for 4 years because Putin believes in rules. And according to the Russian constitution back then, he was supposed to step down. But then in 2011, on the heels of the Arab Spring, there was a huge upheaval in Russia following the rigged election, parliamentary election. And that became a turning point for both Putin and Russia, because Putin perceived it as a great betrayal on behalf of a certain group in the Russian society. And he returned in 2012, and he began a more repressive sort of course to fix what he thought was wrong with that part of the society. And then I think another turning point came in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine. And since then, it kind of went downhill. So we only see deterioration of any weak signs of democracy we had at the time, and Putin is getting more conservative, more repressive, more authoritarian, more cruel. But one thing that I think important to know or understand about him is that with the annexation of Crimea, which was hugely popular and is still popular, he sort of changed, I think, personally, in the sense that he now sees himself as a historical figure. And so he sees his own policies within, thousands of years of Russian history. So he wants to go down in history as this great person, like Peter the Great type of Russian ruler. And that makes him particularly dangerous, I think. So going forward, I think we will see more of that side of him sort of becoming more visible.
Yeah, and here I'll put in a plug for you. Recently wrote an article about Putin's sort of warped perception of Russian history, which is absolutely worth a read. So let me turn to you, Andras. How have you seen Putin change over the 24 years or so he's been in power?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Let me pick it up from where Olga left off. Putin regarding himself as a historical leader, and I think with that, his focus has also changed. He has, especially over these past years, this is his latest presidential term. He has become more disinterested, or shall I say, less interested in the minutiae of domestic politics. And there was indeed an attempt over the past years to make the system that Putin built, a system of governance, which I will mention in a second, run itself. And the system underwent various stress tests. For instance, the COVID pandemic was such a stress test, which it largely, in spite of Russia's lamentable results handling the pandemic, the system itself largely withstood, in as much as the failures of that were committed, or the sort of the bad results under the pandemic did not really affect the durability of the system of governance that Putin built. So I think this is an important change, that Putin is much more interested in foreign policy, in great power games now than he was in his first terms. And we also know, and if we think about COVID, we also probably have now grounds to assume that during COVID and the isolation that it brought on Putin himself, he has become more and more interested in this specific historic role that Olga mentioned. And the COVID sort of created an echo chamber by limiting the amount of people who could, whom Putin interacted with and who filtered the information that he got. But beyond that, and this has been widely discussed, beyond that, I would just like to mention a couple of processes that underpinned 20 years, or more than 20 years now, of Putin's governance. First of all, the relentless centralization of public governance, which is only once with the when gubernatorial elections, direct gubernatorial elections were brought back briefly, not briefly, sorry, they brought back, and then the Kremlin found different ways to sort of control regional politics after these were brought back in 2012. But apart from that, fiscal centralization, centralization of governance, centralization of surveillance of every aspect of public life, how politics has been gradually pushed back from the federal level, first to regional levels, and then nowadays to local levels and local problems. I think this is very important. And then the other thing is that I would like to point out is the securitization of public discourse. What this means is that an increasing array of things in domestic as well as foreign policy have come to be viewed through the prism of national security. I think Russia's latest national security strategy 2021 was a good example of what this means in practice, which extended the language of national security to areas such as culture. You see separatism come up in discussions about various local movements even. more and more often. Separatism was mentioned in the constitutional reform of 2020, which many people then focused on Crimea and the annexation of Crimea and how this cemented the annexation of Crimea. But it was also about local movements questioning the authority of Moscow. So with that, I believe the dividing line between enemies and traitors has also shifted, and that's a very important distinction, or what used to be a very important distinction of Putin for Putin, and now that is more and more, there are more and more traitors and less enemies.
So more and more internal traitors and less and fewer external enemies?
More and more. So the distinction between traitors and enemies that Putin traditionally made was enemies you deal with, traitors you do not, like traitors you deal with by means of force. So it was while there was a clear line between these, or while there were clearly people who domestically engaged in criticizing the regime, but were not regarded as traitors or foreign agents, the system did what it could to repress them, but not in ways as you would repress a traitor, which would be a total elimination, be it locked up as long as Putin is alive, as they often say it's about political prisoners nowadays in Russia, or murder them.
Well, actually, you've provided us a nice segue to the next question I wanted to ask. Speaking of people the Kremlin sees as traitors, Alexei Navalny's death eliminated the most vocal and popular challenger to Putin. But nevertheless, thousands of Russians defied police to pay tribute to him on the day he died, and thousands more turned out on the day. So what is the state of popular resistance to Putin's regime in Russia today? And is there space in the near future for the emergence of liberal democratic resistance? Let me start with you again, Olga.
Well, it's a very difficult question because I guess, well, one of the key reasons is if you are inside Russia, it's really difficult for you to show what you really think, what you really believe, what you prefer politically, because essentially you can get arrested for just expressing your opinion that goes against the government's line. For criticizing authorities, the sort of legal apparatus is huge and very repressive. So people try to keep to themselves if they disagree. So that creates this asymmetry in the public space that that is difficult to sort of parse out. We don't really know what's happening in people's head. There's actually a research on that by Timur Kuran. He's a scholar, I think, at the University of South Carolina, who came up with a concept of preference falsification. And this is how sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union actually was explained in literature. One of of the ways why these events come such a surprise. And sort of his view was that there is a private preference that people keep to themselves, and then there is a public preference. If you're asked if you support Putin or, I don't know, the Soviet Union, they will say, yeah, of course I support. And therefore, the perception now, if you sort of look at what's happening in Russia, might be that the regime has won, the opposition has been dismantled, it has been beheaded, all the vocal critics are either dead or in exile or in jail. So there is no one to lead the opposition, if it's even there. And then there is a separate sort of conversation about the fact that, actually Russians all support Putin. If you look at the numbers, there is no future for liberal democratic opposition in the country. So I think there is a lot of distortion going on. I would say from my perspective, because I did work with the Russian opposition movement for some time, a lot of people who support democracy for Russia are outside of the country, but there is a significant number still working or doing something inside the country. So you mentioned thousands of people going out to support or to say goodbye to Navalny. And I think one of the reasons it was so peaceful is because after the entire absolutely horrible behavior of the local authorities who refused to release Navalny's body to his mother, there was an outrage, even among the more conservative parts of the society, because this is kind of a sacred act. And so there was sort of the Kremlin allowed for the actual funeral to take place peacefully and allowed for people to come and say goodbye without the police actually arresting them. So that's what's happening if there is a little bit of a relief in the current sort of pressure on the opposition, which kind of gives me hope. That means that not everyone supports what's happening in the country. Not everyone supports the war. Not everyone supports Putin, even though the same people might say that they do or vote for him. But if the circumstances change, we might see a reconciliation, I guess, between their private preferences and public preferences.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. András, over to you. What's your take on the state of popular resistance to Putin's regime in Russia today?
So I'm going to say a couple of words about Navalny in a minute, but just wanted to continue, but down the line that Olga started about the difference between publicly expressed preferences and private preferences. So I think that that, for instance, if you look at the presidential campaign, if we can call it that, of the past couple of months, things like things like signing up to support Boris Nadezhdin, the quote-unquote anti-war candidate that was briefly sanctioned by the authorities in as much as they let him collect signatures and then they disqualified him. So signing up for Nadezhdin was a relatively low-risk, low-cost way of engaging in anti-war activism. You could do it. It was tolerated. People knew it was tolerated, although you could still, there was still a risk factor in the sense that your name and your data might be handed to the authorities, and who knows what this Nadezhdin story will turn out later. But even so, you did not really have to be afraid of being arrested on the spot. So that suggested that the authorities were trying themselves to feel out how big the support of an openly anti-war position was in the society. And there are other recent reports suggesting that the authorities are indeed very afraid of turnout, because if you're just talking about the election for a second, turnout is an important factor for the Kremlin, because it's not just that Putin needs to win by a large margin. It's not just that's just one half of the desired result. The election also needs to show that a large part of the population is willing to participate in this, and it is willing to sort of anoint Putin for a fifth term. I'm not saying that turnout cannot be engineered. Turnout can be engineered, and we might talk about that later, but it is less difficult to engineer turnout if the base turnout is already high. So, for instance, just this week, or maybe it was today, the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, was already putting out what I would call excuses in advance for a low turnout, saying that if it's foreign security services that are trying to suppress turnout in Russia. So that to me, suggests an underlying fear of low turnout, and low turnout can be the result of various things, not only of liberal democratic opposition to Putin, but that's certainly part of it. And about other forms of resistance. So Navalny's biggest contribution, or at least one of his biggest contributions to Russian politics, was that he established this organization that was basically a machinery to turn various disjointed local grassroots movements, grievances, and so on into actual votes and power at the local level. And it allowed these movements to communicate with each other, to learn from each other, to sort of feel like they were part of one thing. And this network was systematically dismantled, not since 2022, it started earlier, but it was systematically dismantled over the past couple of years. As Olga mentioned, its leaders were either jailed or they are in exile. This matters because people like that are usually the risk takers that movements like Navalny's or movements that resistance movements need, or protest movements need, to go out and say, I am going out, to then attract other people. But the grievances are still there. They are, various local grievances about prices, about utility networks, about veterans returning from, or rather not returning from the war in Ukraine. That the Kremlin is clearly worried about, is trying to sort of apply palliative care to some of these issues that cannot really be helped otherwise because of budgetary constraints, or because the focus is somewhere else. So they are simply trying to make sure that nothing immediate comes of them. But whether or not these can be linked up with liberal democratic resistance to Putin's regime under the current circumstances, or an anti-war agenda, is very questionable.
Okay. Thank you both. So let's look at it from the other side. Most of the criticism that Putin has gotten over the course of 2+ years after his invasion of Ukraine has come from the right, has come from people saying he's not prosecuting the war violently enough, and his aims aren't expansive enough. So is there a threat to Putin from the right? Something we'd probably rather not think about, but is there someone worse than Putin? Is he receiving pressure from the right? Could he be replaced by someone who's actually harder to deal with for not only Ukraine, but the US and its partners and allies in Europe? Let me start with you, András, and then we'll go to Olga.
So we have seen over the past year, 2 years, we have seen attempts, right? Prigozhin was an attempt, sort of. Igor Girkin, people like him, war correspondents, with their followers, that many of us refer to as Z-heads. But we need to see that these movements, these criticisms, were fueled by battlefield losses. And lately, there haven't really been any major battlefield losses for Russia. So I'm not going to go into this part too far because I'm not a military analyst. So perhaps the Russians are learning. Perhaps it is due to inaction of Ukraine's backers. Both are plausible. But either way, this factor is not there. For the sort of turbo nationalist opposition to feed on, and at the same time, Putin also found a narrative grip on the war. It is now, and this has been hammered since at least mid last year. This is a civilizational conflict for Putin, and it is an inevitable war. But also at the same time, victory is always just around the corner. It's just, just another village or city away to be taken by Russian soldiers in Ukraine, or is just another election away in the West. And I think Putin needs both of these to be true, or to be believed by a critical number of people, both elites and citizens, to work. But as long as a critical number of them sign up to this, which in practice also means that they are okay pouring resources in the short term into the war. The military budget for this year went up by 60% over 2023, where it was already high. I don't see a potent turbo nationalist resistance emerging, or even the official narrative being seriously challenged by something. And when you look at the economy too, mobilization economy, that was another agenda of those who criticized how the war was prosecuted from the right. Mobilization economy is slowly becoming a reality anyway. Most of the economic growth last year, and what we see this year too, is due to the defense industrial complex and state orders through the defense industrial complex and its adjacent industries. Nationalization, renationalization of strategic enterprises, including and mostly in the defense industrial complex, but not only, is in full swing. I think Novaya Gazeta had a recent investigation into this and found that 180 enterprises were taken into that under the control of the state in the past 2 years, and this is going to continue. The tax and customs policy changes that we saw over the past year, just grabbing the extra profit wherever it materializes and turning it into war spending. So I think for now there is this narrative grip and supported with these policy changes, and theoretically, anyone who comes after Putin will have, even if it's a nationalist, will have the added benefit of not being pursued by the International Criminal Court. So I don't want to speculate on what that person would look like, but theoretically, that is still going to be a different person. But the narrative that Putin has built is already this sort of mobilizational narrative.
Yeah, thanks, Andras. Olga, let me revise the question or refine the question a little bit for you. I think Andras answered that really well. But is this war existential for Putin? What if Russia does suffer a serious reverse in Ukraine? Is there likely to be a challenge to Putin in that case?
Let me just add one point to what Andras was saying, because I think, well, he did answer it fully, but I just wanted to add like one extra detail, because I think Putin is actually calculating very carefully about his incorporation of nationalists into his support group. It's a very passionate group, and he likes to use that rhetoric because it allows him to fuel the discourse about the victory, about Russia as a separate civilization. He has been pursuing a reconstruction of Russian national identity over the course of his last couple of terms. So that kind of like comes together, and he sees nationalists, and I think people around him see nationalists as an instrument to the purpose of their grip on power, if that makes sense. So in terms of losing the war, I don't know if it's existential. I think it's a philosophical ground, but I think he cannot allow to lose that war, and then the conversation just moves into the sort of gray area of what defines a victory, right? So what is essentially winning this war or losing this war? So I guess losing this war would be losing Crimea, because I think he can surrender partially the parts of Donbass, whatever Russian troops have taken over, and explain it somehow. Well, we didn't need it anyway. It's going to be bad, but he can absorb the blow. But Crimea would be the sort of the existential blow. And what comes next? I don't think he his position will be insecure because he made sure over the last couple decades he built a very strong security apparatus. I think public opinion of him will actually be very disappointed, but it still doesn't mean that essentially people will revolt and like will kick him out of the Kremlin. He might still survive, but essentially, if we go back to the fact that he wants to be a historical figure, his entire legacy will be destroyed, and he cannot allow that. So he might continue this tepid war, frozen conflict type of situation for a long time. But I don't think he wants the cost. So he wants to stop it now while he's still winning. And I think that's why he kind of offered through the interview of Tucker Carlson an opportunity for the United States to consider convincing Ukraine to stop the war and freeze it at this moment. So, yeah.
Thank you. And thanks for bringing Crimea up again. You mentioned earlier, and I wanted to circle back to that the 2014 annexation of Crimea, although manifestly illegal under international law, was genuinely popular in Russia. Maybe the most popular thing that Putin did with ordinary Russians. And so highlighting that Crimea holds a special sort of status emotionally for Russians, I think is worthwhile. So does not mean that the annexation was not illegal, that it's not legally part of Ukraine, but it does mean that a Russian reaction to losing Crimea would be different than losing the other 4 provinces that they've illegally annexed. So thank you for bringing that up. Let me ask this, Olga, we'll start with you. So you often, all of us do it. I did it earlier when I said Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but we often conflate Putin and Russia. But is this correct? To what extent does Putin set the agenda? What extent does he reflect elite consensus, foreign policy, national security policy consensus? And are there centers of power that he doesn't control?
I think it's a common, I don't know if it's a mistake, however, but it's something that a lot of people do, conflating Russia and Putin. I know that the position of the Russian opposition is that these are 2 separate things, and we should never conflate the 2. But I think it slightly misrepresents what Russia is today. Again, like, because we don't know what the public opinion actually holds in Russia. We don't know people's true preferences. However, there is research that shows that about 40% of Russian people in general are pretty apathetic and will support any kind of power. That comes from a long term of the Soviet Union sort of obedience and a lack of experience where people take an active position in political life. Does that mean that people support everything Putin does? Not necessarily, but there's a large proportion of the population. And then we have, again, those nationalists who are ardently supporting everything that Putin is doing, especially when it comes to the war. They may not support some policies, but in general, and recently they have been on the same side. So we have, let's say, half of the population who are more or less, I don't want to say supportive, but passive about what Putin does. And I think it's important to understand about the Russian public, the fact that they don't see connected to politics, to political events. What they see on TV is like watching a TV show, people in the Kremlin making those moves so far away, so they don't have this immediate connection to what's happening unless it's right in their yard. Therefore, we have this sort of opposite forces that make people, on the one hand, support whatever the authorities are doing, on the other hand, not feeling particularly connected to them, and that's the majority of the population. So I don't know, can we say that this is Russia? Can we say that this is Putin? It's hard to say. And I think another point I want to bring up, propaganda does work, and Putin has been really effective in constructing a very compelling narrative and sort of tapping grievances and resentment over the collapse of the Soviet Union, over the loss of status globally and sort of domestically. And he was able to use that to create the perception that Russia is surrounded by enemies. And when you feel threatened, you sort of get together, you support your leader. So that's another incentive for people to side with Putin, even maybe ideally in peacetime they would not support him.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to come back to this idea of Russia as a besieged fortress surrounded by enemies, because I think it's interesting. But Andras, let me kick it over to you. Does Putin set the agenda or just reflect the agenda?
So I think my main point on this would be, apart from what Olga has already said about the difficulties of surveying public opinion in Russia, we do have various public opinion surveys, Russian field surveys, attitudes about the war, Levada Center surveys attitudes about the war as well. This data has to be handled with care and with reservations because of the reasons that Olga mentioned. So I would say, though, that Putin definitely wants us to conflate him and Russia. One of the core points, it's just a recent example of his State of the Nation speech in February, was that there is a huge majority behind them and that there's a new elite of war participants. Now, there's very little to actually suggests that what the Russian authorities are often very keen on saying, that if you go to the war and you return, you're going to that will open the door for you to certain positions in public in public administration. The people who do receive, the precious few people who have so far received such opportunities were usually officials before they went to the war and then came back. So it was rather a call to the elite to fall in line, to basically to tell them that this is the majority, this is normalcy, this is what normal behavior looks like, and if you don't do it, you're a deviant, and we are going to deal with you like that. And the message goes out to both elites and to citizens. So in this way, yes, Putin does set the agenda. It doesn't mean that there isn't a large number of Russians who, for whatever reason, be it because they are beneficiaries, material beneficiaries of the war, because of the rising salaries in the military and in the military-industrial complex, or because they are businessmen who are part of the business elite and are taking over enterprises from Western organizations that leave Russia, or because they are associated with the security services and benefit from the securitization of domestic politics. These are people who directly benefit from the current policy, not necessarily from the actions of the Russian military in Ukraine as such, but of where money is poured, what priorities are set, and what you can say and what you cannot say. So this is the agenda currently, and for everything else, for everything that Putin might think, Putin might say about what Russia is and what Russia will be, well, there is not much we know about that. In the same State of the Nation speech, he did make a lot of promises that can cost anywhere between 10 and 17 trillion rubles between now and 2030 to accomplish. And Russia currently does not have this amount of money to spend on those priorities. So were these actual promises? Well, some of them may have been, but most of them seem to be simply a way of saying, well, just trust us. We can do this. We can deal with this. The war will not affect the life of most of you, right? So, and to the question of whether or not there are smaller local centers of power independent of Putin, well, there are. But their influence does not extend enough to directly challenge the primacy of Putin or even the priorities set by Moscow very often. So, these are important to study because they can cause complications. They can create unexpected domestic political risks, such as elections don't turn out the way they should, that currently wants them to turn out, like in the Far Eastern Republic of Khakassia last year, or there's the question of does Putin control Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya, or to what extent does Moscow and the security services and Putin control him, or is it rather a sort of a mutual destruction, a mutually assured destruction deal? So, while these are important, and while these are these centers of power are important to study because it means that the current position means that their current behavior is not an enthusiastic support for either Putin or the system, but an opportunistic support, and we need to understand what underlies that opportunistic support. But it's not enough for them to directly challenge any agenda or narrative that is set from the federal center.
Okay, thank you. So last question, we're getting, we've got at least 4 questions already in the Q&A, and I want to get to those. So I'm going to give you a tough assignment. In 2 minutes or less, what does the U.S. do about Russia? What should our policy be on Russia? Let me start with you, András, and then go to Olga.
So the very abstract answer to this, but I think that what we have to start with is based on what I said earlier. Putin's narrative about a war that is based on 2 pillars. One, that the war is civilizational, it's inevitable, it's the West, a collective West in war with Russia, and that victory is just around the corner. In order to challenge Putin's narrative, in order to undermine this narrative, you need to challenge both of these. So I think what it means translated into practical policy is work with dissidents, support them, protect them. It has come up several times over the past 2 years, whether the West is able and willing to protect Russian dissidents of any sort who enter their countries, or they will find that they are unwelcome, or they will find that the Russian security services can indeed reach them and take revenge on them for their activities. This I think it means also dismantling the networks of international corruption that currently allows Russia to circumvent sanctions. These networks are used. We have seen how they are used. We've seen that there is certainly a way to squeeze sanctions further. This is to undermine the policy that builds a pro-war coalition in Russia, and also continue shaking the tree. By shaking the tree, I mean creating these political risks within Russia, both by empowering actors who deliver key information, key local, who are able to build local resistance to policies that locals don't agree with, or that cause local grievances, and tighten sanctions and create domestic political risks in that way. I think there is still a lot of room there. And of course, the other part of this is continuing to support Ukraine with arms, with politically, economically, in order to hammer home that victory is not for Russia. That is, victory for Russia is not just around the corner. It is very far away, and if it will ever happen at all. So beyond this, if we are talking about the elections, I think there is an argument to be made for saying that the elections, as they are held, cannot be recognized as such because they were held on internationally unrecognized territory. And I think it's important also to talk about this, but for practical results, I think it's more important to focus on that, on challenging that narrative in both parts of it.
Okay, all right, thank you. And you actually just pre-answered a question that appeared in the Q&A, and that is, some are advocating that Western nations don't recognize the legitimacy of Putin's election coming up here. Vladimir Karamurza published an op-ed in the Post today. The question is, do you see that happening? How likely, and if so, what impact? So let me go to Olga real quickly and ask you, Olga, as quickly as you can, give us an answer on what do we do about Russia?
Well, I think András already answered that question. I'm just going to add a few points on top of everything he said, because I totally agree with what he said. So maybe in terms of immediate support for the opposition movement, I think the focus should be on civil society organizations and independent media organizations, because they have, especially the media, I think they have their audience inside Russia, and they're willing to provide that audience, which is pretty significant, with accurate information, and sort of sustaining that audience, still keeping them in play, is important. So that's something that can be done immediately. Supporting Ukraine, of course, is important. Sanctioning all those attempts to circumvent the existing sanctions. There is also a lot of capital from the oligarchs that is still distributed somewhere in the world that could be captured. And one thing that I want to add is that actually comes up a lot. So Russia places a premium on conducting an information war. I know information war has been on the agenda for a long time, but I feel like it has been dispersed, and there has to be a better effort to counter the narratives and the capacities that the Russians are employing to push for false narratives, misinformation, disinformation, because especially in today's world, especially on social media, everything is immediate. And this has to be somehow contained. And I think the current effort of just sort of dissecting post-factum things that have been said but are long gone in Twitter world, for example, is less effective. And one final point, I think it makes sense to think about a Russia strategy in the long term, because I don't think that Putin is going anywhere anytime soon. And having each president of the United States or each European leader sort of come up with their own policy towards Russia is actually playing into Russia's hands, into Putin's hands, who has been there for 20 years, watching leaders come and go, and he's still there. So he sees the benefit of having sort of this fragmented Western policy towards Russia as a benefit. So if there is a way to build up a coherent effort that looks at Russia in the long term, how to help Russian people become more democratic, help them understand democracy will actually bring them the results that they are looking for, stability, prosperity, and all that stuff. And I believe that the change will come from within. So an investment into Russian civil society, Russian opposition is a good investment in the long term.
Yeah, that's a great point about taking the long view of policy and strategy toward Russia, right? I mean, the last time we did that, frankly, was when George Kennan did it in the late 1940s. with the long telegram, the X article, and then what eventually became our containment policy, which each successive administration interpreted a little differently, but nevertheless, we stayed within the general boundaries of Kennan's initial idea. So let's hope that we take Russia seriously enough that we feel the need to do something like that again, strategy that will be sort of evergreen and persist for decades. Let me get to the Q&A because there are several here in the question and answer box. The first one is, what role did the siloviki or the security services have in shaping the Kremlin's distinguishing between traitors and enemies? András, that was your term. You want to take that one on?
Well, it was the term that these are terms that come from Putin, not me. So just to underline that, but what the siloviki had in shaping the Kremlin's distinguishment, well, I think this is a question that we can at most speculate about. We know that we know the security agencies that sort of handle Putin's agenda, that Putin relies on to make sense of the world. So in that sense, yes, they certainly had a lot to do with this. But in general, I would say the extension of the security services' role in domestic politics over the years, and I'm not only talking about the FSB, but also the Nacgvardia, the National Guard that is directly under Putin, or the FSO, the Federal Protective Service, has shaped the understanding of friends and enemies. And you can track this, by the way, in how the Russian legislature gradually extended the definition of foreign agents from initially it required a connection, a financial connection between you and your foreign backers. For instance, now you can label foreign agent pretty much anyone whose activities the Russian government deems to be influenced or deems to be aligned with a foreign organization. So I think that change shows how this line has been pushed out between this dividing line between enemies and traitors. Enemies, in Putin's distinction, and again, just to add this very short point, enemies were people who fought against you. Traitors were people that worked with you or with which you were on the same team, and then they stabbed you in the back. So this is important to know for the if you're looking at the evolution of this, like how the group that you were in one group with, and then they stab you in the back, also probably evolved in the understanding of the Russian authorities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Olga. Let me turn to you for this next one. It says the means that we used to support Ukraine used to extend to naming and combating the Kremlin's corruption. Do you think more could be done here?
Can you repeat that? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, the question is, the diplomatic and military means used to support Ukraine used to, in the past, they extended to naming and combating Russian corruption or the Kremlin's corruption. Can we do more there?
In terms of corruption, is that the question?
In terms of naming and shaming, the type of thing Navalny
naming and shaming
made a
corruption.
career of doing.
Right. It's a good question. I think that sort of every nation has, I think, a perception ceiling in terms of how much corruption you can accept. And I think in Russia, everyone has accepted this as a corrupt country. So exposing corruption in Russia doesn't make much of a difference. And I think Navalny's documentaries have shown that, especially the one about the Putin's palace, was viewed by over 100 million people, and that has changed nothing. So yes, there is this sort of outrage, but does it make people want to do anything about it? It's not clear. Again, because in the circumstances of the Russian society and the Russian political system, There is very little that you can do. People have been divided and atomized. There is no infrastructure in the society, in the civil society. It has been incrementally dismantled through a series of laws and practices. So the only sort of get together among Russian people you can get if there is a natural disaster and people are rushing to help, or if someone is ill and people can donate. There is a good sort of side to that, but I don't see corruption being an issue that people sort of suddenly become united around to counter the current regime. I think also in the West and elsewhere that has been also accepted. Russia is corrupt, corrupt oligarchs everywhere. Let's fight them. The conversation goes on, but nothing really changes. And the reason is that the Russian wealth and the Russian capital has been deeply enmeshed with Western capital. So you kind of have to shoot yourself in the leg to do that. So I think maybe taking a more clear sort of ethical or moral stand for the leaders who can afford it, that could be something to do, at least in terms of the conversation. Putin can't point to this leader and say, like, okay, I know how much you cost. I can put you in a pocket. Just give me a price tag. He can't do it with every leader, but he can do it with some. So the more leaders that have this clarity and this sort of reputation, the less opportunities for Putin to accuse Western leaders in hypocrisy. So I guess this is the extent of it.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to combine two questions here because they both deal with the war in Ukraine. One asks, is it true that Russia is suffering enormous casualties in Ukraine? What would the domestic impact of that be? The second one asks about Putin's power if the war goes badly. And the question essentially is whether an elite, like a palace coup, is a possible outcome if things go badly for Putin in Ukraine. I will just say the official figures that we hear from the US Department of Defense and the UK Ministry of Defense is that 315,000 of the 360,000 troops that Russia had in its active duty military have been either killed or wounded in the 2 years of war in Ukraine. So, but how about the impact of that in terms of general domestic impact or palace coup?
So there are obviously huge losses that Russia has sustained over the past 2 years, and there's no denying that that has had a domestic impact. Soldiers, wives, mothers have been protesting, for instance. Will it bring down the regime? No, at this point, it's definitely not going to bring down the regime for the reason that I have mentioned earlier, that the narrative that this is a civilizational conflict, we are facing the collective West, and that victory is just around the corner, is still strong. And also because of the very harsh penalties that you can receive for criticizing anything about the official narrative on the war. So as for a palace coup, well, it's very, if we knew about a palace coup being organized, that would mean that the palace coup has failed. So the chances of replacement of Putin would depend, I think, and this is pure speculation, on an opportunity to organize, which is currently very difficult, for a clear alternative to the current policy, which there is none or no obvious one, at least recently, currently, for most of the elite. And of Putin's attempts to build this pro-war coalition failing. And at this point, I don't see that happening either. So, we're talking about an autocracy. if Putin will win the election on Sunday, so that's what you're going to see, 80% of support probably, but that does not guarantee that he's going to be in power until 2030, which is when his term will. But it is all. It also, but just the fact as that's because we're in an autocracy, so palace coups can happen. But just the fact that the war is not going particularly well does also not mean that there is an opportunity, there are grounds, and there is a demand for a palace coup.
So we're 1 minute over, but we have one more question, and I don't want to leave one question unanswered while answering the rest. And the last question is, there was a secret paper published by hackers on Putin's plans for after the election. Is it real? What can be done to counter his plans of further increasing propaganda at home and disinformation dissemination abroad? Olga, do you want to start?
I haven't read the paper, so I'm not sure I can offer an insight on that. But I can say that I think, as I mentioned previously, a coherent strategy that could counter the propaganda that Putin has been putting inside Russia and also outside Russia could be an effective tool. However, I think it is really important to pinpoint, so the way the propaganda works is very diffuse. There are several key messages, and then there is the noise, and a lot of people sort of get distracted by the noise. They get into fights, they get into this side-long conversations, but I think the main point is to stay focused. So there are pressure points for Putin, the sensitive spots where I think starting from the leaders on top and onto journalists or public opinion leaders on lower levels of the structure of the public opinion, if everyone sort of goes after those points, you know, how the annexation of Crimea was illegal, just regardless of how it looks from inside Russia, or how Putin has been in power for 24 years. Isn't it strange that he has to stay in power? You know, like identifying those pressure points and hammering on them and making it a concerted effort, the way sort of the Russian propaganda makes it a concerted effort, and not get distracted by little jabs that the propaganda figures do from time to time.
Okay, thanks. András, your thoughts, final thoughts.
Yes, final thoughts. So I believe so. This is about the leaks about how I think Mark Galeotti said Putin was pre-rigging the election. I think that's a very good expression to use here with propaganda, both home and abroad, and what the Russian authorities are spending on, often covertly. I think, like, in the grand scheme of things, there was nothing new there. We knew that these things were happening. But the reason why these leaks were interesting was that we saw how things were happening down at the lowest level, and also we got an idea about the Kremlin's fears, about the Kremlin's insecurities. And as I have mentioned, one of these insecurities is that their turnout at the election is going to be low, that it's going to be difficult to engineer or let's say cost effective, because if the authorities, I think, wanted, they will be able to do this, but it's going to be cost effective to engineer the desired turnout and result in the presidential vote. And that will somehow carry the message that people are not all that enthusiastic about 5-6 more years of Putin and everything that entails. And I think that's a key point there. What I have earlier mentioned about our duty here in the West to also engage with Russian dissidents, as well as obviously supporting Ukraine. That I think will be key for our future relationship with Russia in the post-Putin Russia, whoever comes after Putin. It is not about pushing one particular agenda. It is not about pushing one particular opposition movement, which would, rightly be called interference. It is about empowering the people who are affected by all of these negative developments that happen domestically inside Russia, the terrible public services, the lack of money, military mobilization, and so on, and are anxious and upset about it, to express this anxiety and annoyance, and do this in their own ways, and with leaders that are local and can mobilize them. I think that's a key point in countering these threats that, yes, affect all of us here, also in the West, but that can be dismantled only if we also engage with Russians who want change.
Okay, thanks. So Olga and András, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your thoughts. Again, two of our star scholars on Russia, for sharing your thoughts on the upcoming Russian elections. Thanks to everyone who joined us online today. Again, in the chat, there are links to Olga and András's latest work, and the rest of their work and the work of the rest of our Eurasia Program fellows and scholars is available at fpri.org. So thank you to everyone for your support. Stay tuned, and I guess watch turnout in the Russian elections for some maybe implicit messages about Putin's actual level of support. So thank you very much.